On a December night in 1949, the United States government deliberately released a cloud of radioactive iodine over its own sleeping citizens, then said nothing for 40 years. Another file follows the survivors of a hydrogen bomb test. People quietly turned into a long-term radiation study without ever being asked. And a third describes how the Army secretly sprayed a chemical powder over a crowded housing project full of children, telling the families it was only a harmless smokescreen. These were not accidents of war. They were planned, recorded, and stamped secret. Tonight, we open 8 more files. Real operations, real victims, real money. Each one stayed hidden until a lawsuit, a hearing, or a long-delayed report forced it open. The first file begins in the cold desert wind of eastern Washington. File 1, the Green Run, at the Hanford site in December 1949, at the secret plutonium plant in Hanford, Washington. The government carried out a deliberate experiment. As part of an effort to study radiation detection, it intentionally released a cloud of radioactive iodine, 101 onto the open air, allowing it to drift downwind across eastern Washington and into Oregon. The people living below that plume were never told. They breathed the air, drank the milk from cows that grazed on contaminated grass, and went on with their lives, unaware that they had become unwitting test subjects in their own backyard. The release was codenamed the Green Run, and for decades it simply did not exist in any public record. The truth surfaced only in the late 1980s after a reporter pressed for the files and a Freedom of Information lawsuit pried the documents loose. Today, the declassified Hanford monitoring records sit in the Department of Energy's OpenNet archive. Written in the plain language of a government measuring its own people, a nation had poisoned the air over its citizens and called it research. The next file leaves the desert for an island in the Pacific. File 2, Project 4.1, the Castle Bravo fallout study. On the 1st of March, 1954, the United States detonated a hydrogen bomb codenamed Bravo over Bikini Atoll. At 15 megatons, it was far more powerful than its designers had expected, and the explosion blanketed the nearby inhabited island of Rongelap in white fallout. The Marshallese living there had no warning. Children played in the strange dust, and some later said they thought the falling flakes were snow. In the days that followed, people grew sick. What the survivors did not know was that the government saw an opportunity in their suffering. Under the name Project 4.1, the exposed islanders were enrolled in a long-term study of radiation in human beings, observed and measured for years, with a contaminated group and a comparison group. It was kept classified for around 40 years to avoid public back. It came to light only in 1994, examined by a federal advisory committee on human radiation experiments, and documented through the National Security Archive and declassified records at the National Archives. A nuclear accident had been quietly turned into an experiment on its victim. The next file returns to American ground and to a crater you can still see today. File 3, the Sedan Crater, and Operation Plowshare. In the early 1960s, the government had a strange idea. If nuclear bombs were powerful enough to destroy cities, perhaps they could also be used to dig. Under a program called Plowshare, the plan was to detonate nuclear devices to move Earth, to carve harbors and canals where shovels would take years. To test it, in July 1962, the Sedan device was buried in the Nevada desert and set off. The blast threw out an enormous dome of Earth and left a crater hundreds of feet across and about 320 feet deep. A wound in the ground so large it is still photographed at the Nevada test site today. But the explosion did more than dig. It lofted a vast cloud of radioactive dust into the sky, and that cloud drifted out over the country. A later government reconstruction of nationwide fallout flagged Sedan as one of the single largest sources of radioactive contamination. To reach the American public from any continental test, a project meant to build had instead spread fallout across the heartland. The next file widens the lens to the entire country. File 4, the nationwide iodine 14219 fallout map. The Sedan blast was not an isolated event. Through the 1950s and into the early 1960s, the United States carried out a long series of atmospheric nuclear tests, many of them in Nevada, and each one sent radioactive material into the wind. Among the most dangerous of these was iodine, 191, which settles on grass, passes into cows, concentrates in milk, and gathers in the human thyroid, especially in children who drink it. For years, The government measured and modeled where this fallout went, but it kept the full national picture to itself. Then, in a report released in 1997, the National Cancer Institute laid out the truth in color on a county-by-county map of the country. Its conclusion was staggering. By official figures, essentially every person living in the United States during that testing era had received some thyroid dose of iodine, 191. The exposures had happened decades earlier, and by the time the map was published, nothing about them could be undone. An entire generation had been dosed, and only learned of it long after the fact. The next file shows a place built for the bomb to destroy. File 5, Operation Q, the town built to be nuked. In 1955, on the Nevada test range, the government built a town. It was not a real community, it was a stage. Workers raised fully furnished American homes, painted and finished, and then filled them with the ordinary details of family life. There was food in the cupboards and on the tables, there were clothes in the closet, and inside the houses, posed in living rooms and dining rooms, sat mannequin families, stand-ins for the parents and children of a typical town. Then, the government set off an atomic bomb. Cameras recorded everything. The moment the blast hit, the houses crumpling, the mannequin families scattered at the dinner table. The footage was meant to show civil defense planners and the public exactly what a nuclear weapon would do to a normal home and the people inside. The whole grim demonstration was documented by the Atomic Energy Commission and civil defense agents and survives in public films and photographs, including the documentary made from it. A nation had built a family home for the express purpose of watching it die. The next file trades the bomb for an invisible poison. File 6, the Dugway sheep incident on the 13th of March, 1968. The Army was testing chemical weapons in the Utah desert at Dugway Proving Ground. In one open-air trial, a jet aircraft sprayed the deadly nerve agent VX over the range. Something went wrong. The spray dispenser failed to fully empty as the plane climbed away, and the lethal chemical kept trailing out, carried on the wind far beyond the boundaries of the test area. Miles away, in Skull Valley, the flocks of sheep grazing in the open began to die. By the time it was over, roughly 6,000 sheep lay dead across the valley, and ranchers watched their animals collapse, with no idea why. For years afterward, the Army denied that its nerve agent had caused the death. The truth was finally confirmed by a laboratory report from the Army's own Edgewood arsenal, which found VX in the snow and grass samples taken from the area. That report was declassified in 1978 and made fully public in 1998. Archived at the National Archive, a weapon meant for a remote range had drifted into a valley and killed everything in its path. The next file moves the spraying into a city full of people. File 7. The zinc cadmium sulfide spraying of St. Louis through the 1950s and into the 1960s. The Army was studying how a cloud of biological or chemical agents might spread over an American city and how it might spread over an enemy one. To find out, it secretly sprayed a fine chemical powder, zinc cadmium sulfide, over neighborhoods in Louis, Missouri. The powder drifted down over streets and rooftops, including the densely populated Pruitt-Eagway housing project, a complex full of families and children. The city had been chosen in part because its layout was thought to resemble cities the military might one day need to attack. A stand-in for bombing Moscow, the residents were never told the truth. When they noticed the equipment on the rooftops, they were told it was a protective smokescreen, something meant to keep them safe. It was the opposite. Decades later, the program was partly confirmed by the National Research Council of the National Academy, whose 1997 report on the Army's zinc cadmium sulfide dispersion tests can still be read today. A government had used its own citizens in their own homes as a model for a chemical attack. The next file leaves the ground entirely for a flash seen from space. File 8, the Vela Incident, the double flash of 1979. On the 22nd of September, 1879, an American surveillance satellite called Vela was watching the planet from orbit, built for one purpose: to catch the unmistakable signature of a nuclear explosion. That night, over the remote South Atlantic, near the lonely waters around the Prince Edward Island, one of its instruments recorded the signature it was built to find, the distinct double flash that a nuclear detonation produces. First, a brief pulse of light, then a second, brighter one. The satellite was designed to catch exactly this pattern. And yet, to this day, the United States government has never officially said whether it truly was a bomb, or a White House scientific panel later judged that the flash was probably not nuclear, possibly a small meteoroid striking the aging satellite, while many intelligence analysts remain convinced it was a secret test. Crucially, no corroborating radioactive fallout was ever found, and no nation has ever been named on the record. The declassified National Security Council memos and intelligence file released through the National Security Archive show a government wrestling with a detection it could not fully explain. A flash that looked like a nuclear blast witnessed by an American satellite was quietly filed away as a question. It remains one to this day. 8 more files, and almost every one comes back to the same ground: the air, the soil, and the people standing under it. A government released radiation over its own towns and waited 40 years to admit it. It studied the victims of a bomb instead of only healing them, mapped a dose that reached nearly everyone, and sprayed poison over a quiet valley and a crowded city alike. These are the operations that surfaced because a lawsuit, a report, or a stubborn record outlasted the secrecy around them. The ground remembers what the files tried to forget. Come back when the next one is declassified.